This episode is with Aidan Lee, a PhD student at the University of California Berkeley in the Department of History. Aidan studies East Asian history at Berkeley, and that's his main area of focus, although he does enjoy learning about sports history. More specifically, he focused on sports history in Taiwan. In this episode, Aidan and I talk about East Asian history. This encompasses Taiwan, Japan, and China. We talk about how East Asian history might be seen in today's modern societies in those countries. We also talk about education and the education system that is found in the United States. And then Aidan and I also discuss the importance of sports, how we both incorporate sports in our lives. And Aidan talks about sports history and expands upon that area of research and that field. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider supporting the podcast by subscribing to the channel, by leaving a rating, or by sharing the episode. Thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoy this episode. Well, yeah, I mean, thank you for coming. Thank you for making time. How's your day going? Good Friday?
Yeah, pretty solid. Can't complain. I'm currently on break right now. I'm assuming you are too, right?
Yeah.
So it's pretty chill. Yeah.
Yeah, I start back up around mid-August. I'm not sure when you start back up.
Yeah, I think it's probably similar. I think it's probably the last week of August, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Are you in California right now?
Yeah, I'm currently in Berkeley. Yeah.
Okay. Nice. I went to Berkeley when I was around 15 years old. My sister was gonna go, well, she went to school near there. And so I visited Berkeley, the school, and like the town. It was nice. It's like a very college oriented town. And I thought
Yeah.
that was cool. The school was nice. I mean, I think the weather around there, it's like it's near San Francisco, right? So it's kind of like that weather. It's good weather as well.
Yeah. It's really it's like a lot of microclimates. So like sometimes you'll drive like 10 minutes away from where I live and it's like completely different. It's like 10 degrees cooler or something. But I kind of like it. I'm a distance runner, so I kind of prefer that like colder weather, you know?
Nice. Yeah, but here I'm in Miami right now. It's pretty hot out here, and unfortunately, there's some trouble with my air conditioner. And
Oh,
so
really? Oh
yeah,
no.
so
Oh, that sucks.
they had to order a part to get it fixed, and so it's pretty hot in here. I have the fan going like above me, but still it's like 80 something inside the place. So it's not great, but you deal with it. It
Yeah,
happens.
yeah. Dang, I'm sorry to hear that. Are you like right in the city in Miami or like whereabouts do you live?
Yeah, so you've been to Miami before?
I haven't. I have a
Okay.
good friend who lives there, but I haven't gone yet.
Yeah, so the way, I guess, the more popular area of Miami is, or like downtown, it's like Miami Beach and
Right.
this area called Brickell, which is like kind of the financial district. And I'm about 25 minutes away from there if you go further down south.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit further away from the main, I guess, areas where people like to go to. But I'm closer to the University of Miami itself.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at right now. How long have you been at Berkeley?
So I've been at Berkeley, gosh, I think about 2 years now. So I started the program here in 2020, and I moved here from Richmond, Virginia.
Okay.
Um, I was staying there for about a year. Yeah, so it's been, wow, it's been 2 years. I'm entering the third year of my program this fall.
Nice. And what program is that?
So it's the history department at UC Berkeley, and I specialize in modern East Asia, specifically modern China and Taiwan.
Okay. Did you do something similar in undergrad? What kind of drew you into this field?
Yeah, so I was pretty single track, focused on history. Since undergrad, I went to the University of Virginia for undergrad, and I also did a BA in history there. And then after that, I did a 1-year master's program at the University of Chicago, where I also focused. It was called like an MA in social sciences, but I also focused in East Asian history there. So it's been pretty much, yeah, straight modern history, primarily East Asian history, since I started college.
I see. Okay. What did you, so you went from Virginia to Chicago, and then after the master's program, you wanted to, did you specialize after the master's program, or did you specialize in the master's program?
Well, the way it worked, I originally wanted to go straight into a PhD program. In the first round, I didn't get into the programs that I wanted to, and then but I was offered an MA admission to Chicago, and I was able to go there and sort of build my kind of like academic like resume there, work on some skills, work on some languages. But I was pretty focused on wanting to do modern Chinese or Taiwanese history because I grew up in Taiwan and I already have a sort of language fluency in Chinese. So it was kind of like a natural choice to focus on that specific area for me.
Okay. Taiwan's been like in, I don't know too much about Taiwan, but it's was it part of China sometime like not too long ago, right? And then it separated as its own country.
Yeah, so it's a pretty complicated history,
Okay.
which is why it's like kind of always in the news today. But basically, China, so in the first half of the 20th century, Taiwan actually was a colony of Japan, the Japanese Empire. Before that, it was a colony of China, right? When China still had an imperial system. But after 1945, there was this sort of split between the Chinese Communist Party on mainland China and the Chinese Nationalist Party, which is called the KMT for short. And so they were having this sort of Chinese Civil War going on in the 1930s and 40s. And then after that, after 1945, the KMT took over Taiwan as part of the post-World War II failure of Japan, like the loss of Japanese territories, right? So Japan loses World War II, sorry, and then Taiwan sort of goes to the Chinese. But then what happens over the next 5 years or so, basically the communists slowly edge out the KMT and push them further south. And so it's kind of like, Taiwan currently is in the situation in which it was formerly sort of like one half of the Chinese government, right? The half that lost the Chinese Civil War. And then after about, let's see, the 1990s or so, Taiwan gradually opened up to become a democratic country with its own self-elected government, president, and so on. So its history has kind of diverged from that of mainland China after the 1940s.
Are they still, is it still related to China, however, or no?
Yeah, so culturally speaking, there's a ton of people who migrated to Taiwan from China. Like my grandfather on my dad's side was one of those people. beyond the people who just physically migrated, the language, a lot of the folk religion, yeah, culturally speaking, it's very close. It's very sort of Chinese influence for sure.
Okay. Yeah, because like you said, it's on the news a lot. There's this, and I guess right now with what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, there's this discussion as to whether China wants to kind of try to reinstate itself into with Taiwan and things like that. So it's important to kind of understand the history of Taiwan. What do you think about, when you hear these things about kind of Russia and Ukraine and its relation to how maybe China will try to empower over like this country? What do you think about that? Or like how, from the things that you've learned through studying this country, like what do you see?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting how often it's featured in the news today. If you ask a lot of Taiwanese people, like I grew up in Taiwan up until the end of high school, and these threats from the PRC, they're not new. Certainly, they've sort of ramped up over the last 10 or so years, right? Especially as China becomes more sort of economically dominant and militarily capable. But there's always this sort of disconnect or divergence between sort of Western coverage of Taiwan and especially like news headlines about Chinese threats, right? And the sort of on the ground experience of people in Taiwan. A lot of people, for better or for worse, have sort of gotten used to this constant sort of threatening situation, right? So there's one thing to note in that the split in coverage. But I don't know, what I get out of studying Taiwan, I think one thing, and this is just very general, but appreciating sort of how we got to this point, right, our present day, I think is super important. Because like you said, right, there's still a lot of sort of confusion about what exactly, the status of Taiwan is, both politically and culturally, right? But if you sort of spend time studying, right, the 20th century East Asia in general, you'll see that, all these countries are connected, right? Like Taiwan is this sort of interesting hub in which both Chinese and Japanese influences and greater Southeast Asia, Southeast Asian influences have sort of met. And then what we see in these sort of global conflicts today, it's sort of like the culmination of all those influences, right? Those sort of cultures meeting, different governments sort of moving, across the water, across borders. Yeah.
How have you been to China recently?
I've been to mainland China, let's see, a couple times over the last 5 to 10 years,
Okay.
but not in the last, I think, yeah, not in the last 4 years or 5 years. Yeah.
What, from when you were there? Did you know, like, whenever you're there and whenever you're in Taiwan, do you notice big differences in terms of, not only the government, because I assume the government of Taiwan, and you also mentioned it is like more democratic oriented, but like more so culturally, with it being also a, I guess, a somewhat Japanese influenced society. Like, what do you see differently between when you're in the two different places?
Hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So it depends on where you go. China is enormous, right?
Right.
So if you go to Shanghai, I haven't been to Beijing, but you go to Shanghai, you see basically this sort of identical sorts of amenities when it comes to shopping centers, like high-end malls, convenience stores, really good public transportation, right? When you go to sort of more inland cities or like places that are uh, less developed, you'll definitely see a lot more sort of divergence, right, from a lot of what we consider to be, like modern urban amenities. Um, Taiwan is interesting because you see a ton of very sort of open and outright appreciation for like Japanese consumer products, and that is reflected in like Japanese malls. Like literally, like they'll import like certain like mall brands or like shopping center brands. One of them's called Don Don Donkey. It's recently become popular in Taipei. You'll see a lot of Japanese style like convenience stores in Taiwan. And they sell like Japanese products with Japanese branding, right? I don't think you see as much of that in China, but again, I haven't been there in the last 5 years. And I also haven't been to all of the major coastal cities, so I can't say for sure what's, if that has changed.
Right. Okay. So, but you'd say, from what I'm getting from what you're saying, is that I guess the Japanese culture is quite predominant in Taiwan.
Yeah, I think it's pretty popular. I wouldn't say it's predominant just because in terms of language and ethnic customs, it's
Okay.
Taiwan is still pretty, it's pretty Chinese in that sense. Like all the street signs, for the most part, almost all of them are in Chinese
So
and
it's a
English,
split.
obviously. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's definitely, it's sort of, there's this sort of Japanese flavor to it, but you would mostly consider it a sort of Chinese, right, culturally Chinese,
Okay.
uh, yeah, place.
Yeah. Okay. I see. But yeah, because I didn't know as to whether what culture was like or what cultures you would see or appreciate, or what mix of cultures you would appreciate when you were there. Now, as for the things that you've been studying at Berkeley and kind of specializing in, what aspects of Taiwan have you been researching, or what specifically are you most interested in?
Right. So currently I'm interested in land management and urbanization in Taiwan. So I'm very interested in how the government that came to Taiwan after 1945, right? So this Chinese government from the mainland, how it used land, how land ownership, specifically like real estate from the Japanese administration, how that transferred over to the Chinese government, and then how the Chinese government then sort of reallocated or redistributed it. Part of this story that I find really interesting is how a lot of the military personnel that came from the mainland, a lot of these people were uneducated. They were sort of loyal to the Chinese Nationalist Party, but otherwise, a lot of them weren't. A lot of the military personnel sort of didn't have a lot of experience, in industry or working as government officials. So they had to come here primarily to continue their function as these active service military personnel, and the government had to take care of them, right? So this piece of history that I'm really interested in is the housing, the sort of residential sort of towns, dwellings that were constructed really quickly after 1947 to 1949. What are the conditions in which those communities rose up? Did the government like fully support them? Did they fully support these Chinese soldiers that came over at the expense of maybe local populations? Or was it a much more sort of subtle, much more, even split of resources? So I'm interested in seeing how this history plays out, because today you'll find that a lot of these communities, these military communities, were situated in places that would later become like booming in urban zones, and that today would be sort of the most most expensive real estate, this most sort of like sought after pieces of land in Taiwan. So that's why I'm interested in tracing that. It really has to do with how sort of the present urban landscape is already situated.
Okay. What have you, or what do you think, from what you've learned? I'm sure there are a lot of different causes as to why these urban places are now sought after, right? What kind of influence did these communities of soldiers play in these zones that then made them more desirable to the people of Taiwan?
That's a good question. So a lot of these soldiers, again, they were from very, humble backgrounds. Um, they uh, they were basically subject to, like, if the government had assigned these particular soldiers or this particular battalion in the army, for example, to a specific community, they had no choice. They had to go there. Generally, you'll find that a lot of these communities were actually pretty well stocked. They had rations allotted to them. They had like community spaces. They had like sports fields in some cases, even like cinemas within them. So a lot of the impressions that Taiwanese people had of these newly cropped up military communities were that they were a sort of closed off, kind of like gated community, right? That was better off than the surrounding areas. So that's kind of the impression people had, that these soldiers that came after 1945 or 1947 to Taiwan basically got a lot of government help, and they were sort of living it up in these nicer communities, while other people who are originally in Taiwan, right, even if they're ethnically Chinese, they were kind of subject to harsher treatment by the new government, right? So
Okay.
that's kind of this piece of history that's really fascinating. It's like, did this group that came over from the mainland, did they get a lot more governmental help and benefits, and did that carry over across generations to create this sort of a higher sort of social class, both economically and culturally?
Now, at what point did uh these soldier communities kind of deviate from a military setting into now a more prosperous kind of like population setting, or are they still military kind of zones?
No, they're no longer military
Okay.
zones in most cases, because a lot of these soldiers, it was like a massive amount. It was like, I think 1 to 1.5 million, either military personnel solely, or is it a combination of military and civil officials. I forget the number off the top of my head, but it was a lot of people. The KMT government had to scale down the active duty personnel in the 1950s and 60s, because it became increasingly clear that they weren't going to retake mainland China, right? So a lot of these soldiers that were fighting the Civil War in the 1930s and 40s and fighting against Japan, right? They had, they couldn't continue to be soldiers forever, right? They were getting older, and the government was increasingly aware that, oh, we can't retake the mainland with these, elderly soldiers, right? So in a lot of cases, the soldiers were given pensions, or they were given an opportunity to work in the civil sphere. So like working as government officials or working as teachers, so on and so forth. But they were allowed to continue to live in these military dependent communities, right? Taiwan experienced a lot of economic growth in the 1970s onwards, and often you'll see that these military communities were situated in places that around which would grow a lot of urban developments. Basically whole neighborhoods would crop up around these communities. So they were very well situated in a lot of cases.
Okay. So it was around the 1970s when it started to um deviate from a solely military approach or scene, right?
Yeah, it became sort of more toned down after the 70s and 80s. And by the 80s and 90s, a lot of these communities were sort of renovated. So they bulldozed them and then built like high-rise apartments. And then they would put these old soldiers into the high-rise apartments. So definitely they weren't being monitored like an active military setting, like a sort of mini base anymore. They were sort of let go in that sense.
Okay. I think you mentioned this earlier, but it's something like out of Taiwanese history and East Asian history. It's a very specific period of time and like in a very specific region. I think you mentioned that you're interested in this because it relates to how people are now, I guess, enticed to or they're attracted to these areas and how it affected the urbanization of Taiwan. Is there other reasons as to why this particular piece or like era of history drew you in, or like as to why um you want to continue looking into it?
I think that gets to the kind of the question of why someone would want to be doing history in the first place, right?
Okay.
So you're interested in history, obviously, because you've had guests on here that have talked about, you know, history. I think you had like one professor on, right, from, was it University of Florida, or Miami?
Yeah,
Um,
Miami.
I think when it comes to modern history, I've always been interested in history, but I think modern history is especially interesting because you literally have like I had family members who had lived through these developments, and it's just really cool to think about your own personal connection to a lot of the events that have gone on in the last like 100 to 50 years, even if you personally haven't experienced it. But like my family is very much my dad's side is is Taiwanese Chinese, and from what I know about like the conditions in which my dad grew up, it was totally tied to this history that I'm studying, right? Like my grandpa was a military officer in the KMT, the Chinese nationalists that went to Taiwan. My grandma was a native Taiwanese, so she wasn't from the mainland. At least, you know, her descendants were, but she wasn't. So their marriage was a product of this whole shifting geopolitical situation in the 1940s, right? If that hadn't had happened, you know, my dad wouldn't have been born. So I think that's kind of what ties me directly to this specific topic. I just find it really interesting to think about, you know, how did things like lead up to the present? I'm a pretty present and future oriented person. Like I wouldn't say that studying history necessarily gives you tools to avoid future mistakes, right? If you're thinking from a political perspective. But I think thinking about history really helps you sort of understand yourself and understand the present day in a way that can allow you to make more informed decisions, right? Whether it is through just identifying patterns, right? Or just appreciating like cultural exchanges that occur kind of like randomly in some cases, or very unexpectedly. I think it's definitely enriching for people who are, you know, just interested in even present day culture, right?
Right. Is there something that once you get your PhD, once you learn more about this, is there something that you specifically want to do with it? Like, do you want to focus on maybe going back to Taiwan and then trying to implement some of the, not implement, but out of the things that you learned, devise some things to improve the economy or the living situation of some people? Is there something you want to specifically achieve by learning this, or just mainly to learn and appreciate your culture?
That's a good question. It gets to the sort of career path of someone in academia. I don't know. You know, it's kind of hard to say. I primarily envision when I started this program, I primarily envisioned myself working in the States, like in academia. Um, you know, partially this is just a practical consideration, right? Because someone studying the history of Taiwan or the history of China, going from the US back to Taiwan, like sure, you could offer a lot of interesting insights that you could get through the US education system. right? Because they have a very different kind of style of graduate education between both, between, you know, the US, Taiwan, and China. It's all very quite different. But if you think about like going back to teach like Taiwanese or Chinese history, it doesn't seem like the most pragmatic thing in terms of just finding a job, because like you'd assume that so many people would be like interested in the same things because they have similar backgrounds, right? So I think just from a practical perspective, I'm more oriented to working in the US. But and initially, because my mom is a professor back in Taiwan, she doesn't do history, but she does English and American literature. I was thinking about doing something similar, like teaching in academia in the States. But I don't know if you've heard this from your other guests, but the job market for a lot of, especially humanities jobs in academia in the States, is actually pretty dismal, at least from the records of the last couple of years. And the pandemic has made that worse. So I still have a couple of years till I graduate. So I'm kind of in this situation where I'm kind of becoming more open to working in either like government related work or like non-academic research related work.
Why is that? Why is the job search difficult or dismal, as you said?
I think it's just a lot of PhDs are being produced by programs, and you know it's just extremely competitive, and there's not enough jobs. There's not enough. I think it's a combination of the history departments admitting too many students relative to how many positions are open each year, and just the fact that, you know, departments often face like funding issues, right? Especially with a pandemic, we see that a lot of schools have kind of been struggling to maintain like normal class loads because of online learning, right? A lot of people didn't want to do that. So it's a combination of factors, really, and it's both on the end of producing the PhDs and on the end of universities who aren't hiring enough.
Okay. And now that you've mentioned education and like academia and so on, I think there's this push right now in or at least I feel like, especially with the pandemic, I think a lot of people have realized, and by having money troubles and by going online a lot of the time, I think a lot of people have realized or are realizing that it's receiving higher education, whether it be college or then a graduate degree, it is kind of at times not worth the time, not worth the money, because there's so many resources out there where you can learn better information, the same or better information, about whatever is it you're studying in college or graduate degree, by investing a lot less money. Or you can, for example, take if you want to major in computer science, and a degree for 4 years at a private school, a good private school, is going to be over $200,000, right? But then if you take a Google Analytics course for 6 months, that's maybe 1,000, and then you can get a job with Google. And there's this thing where people are starting, I think, to weigh whether or not these graduate degrees and these just the plain undergrad degrees are worth it. Maybe that has an effect on the market as well. I'm not sure. I'm not sure how it is with the field of history, especially.
I think you're absolutely right. And it might be a little bit treasonous of me to say this, but I agree with you in a lot of cases. I have, you know, I kind of have a separate sort of like work professional or academic life and a lot of the other things that I'm interested in. And I can tell you, like, I love podcasts so much that I listen to podcasts that have absolutely nothing to do with my field of study or like my academic work. Like, I really like science, biology, fitness, you know, even entrepreneurship podcasts. And you learn so much. There's so many things you can learn from absorbing that kind of information, a lot of it is actually produced by people within academia, and from people who have very practical experience, right? Or you could, like, as you say, right, take online sort of certifications or courses and really learn the practical skills you need to complete jobs in a workplace setting without having to go through 4 years of standard education, right? I find it, for sure, I think that it's exciting new territory. I think it's also scary territory for a lot of people in university administration or like faculty. Um, but I'm kind of optimistic. I think, people will find things that work for them, and it's not necessarily the path that has always been tread, right? Like, I grew up in a family that had also always prized like education, um, and specifically the traditional kind of, like, getting good high school grades and then going to a good college and so on, right? But that attitude, if taken too inflexibly, will sometimes can set you up for either like a delayed career or like even disappointment, right? If you don't get the academic job or the specific job you're hoping for with your degree, right? So yeah, I think for when it comes to history, don't know if I can say that much because I'm still a student. I do know that I think in a lot of schools, history majors are declining in number. This was the case at University of Virginia, where I went for undergrad. I think the administration was talking about ways to enroll more students as history majors. And inevitably, it's always about making it more practical for job purposes. Like, what can you do with a history major besides, applying for grad school, or you can work for government, obviously, right? But there's a lot of ways to do that. You don't have to do a history major, right? So yeah, I think it's an ongoing discussion. I don't know the current stats, right? But I feel like if that was happening, like 5 years ago, I can only imagine it's continuing down that path. Right?
Yeah, you somewhat touched on this, but it's the transition between learning something in school, or finishing a degree in something, and then transitioning over to looking for a job in that same area is somewhat conflicting, because, for example, you said history is a good example, but I'm going to use another one just because it's something that I've looked into. you know i i I was thinking of maybe doing a graduate degree in psychology or something to do with neuroscience, because I'm interested in the brain. You might have seen some of my guests are neurobiologists. I'm interested in learning about the brain. A lot of the things I'm interested in involve the brain, like not just the psychology, but for example, with with fitness and so on, how certain things or certain chemistry levels in the brain, certain chemicals affect the rest of your body to perform a certain way, just things like that. But what I was going to get at is, with my interest in the brain and psychology and neuroscience, I was thinking about maybe doing a graduate degree with something to do with that. But then the problem is, I would like to, when looking for a job in that field, if it's neuroscience, you can go be a doctor, but I don't like medicine all that much, so I wouldn't want to be a doctor. If you go into psychology, I mean, you can be a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And if you don't want to do that, you can maybe do research. And I don't want to be a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and I don't just want to do research all the time. And yet I'm still very interested by this field. So what job can I do? I don't know. So I'm probably not going to go do that graduate degree, just because once I'm done with it, what job can I find that I actually want to do? So it's one thing wanting to learn about something and wanting to, or being interested in a certain subject or topic. And then it's another thing studying that if in an academic setting, and then transitioning from that to then looking for a job. It's complicated in that way.
Have you listened to the Huberman Lab podcast? Are you a fan of that podcast?
I haven't listened to his podcasts, but I've listened to him being in a lot of other podcasts. I've listened to him on Joe Rogan and on Lex Friedman.
Okay, yeah. Well, I highly recommend you check it out because you say you're interested in neuroscience. That's an example of a guy who did not get like a medical degree, I'm pretty sure, but he got a PhD in neuroscience, and he's producing this wonderful podcast. He does have a
Yeah.
professor job, right? So that's a caveat. Like he does research at Stanford,
Mhm.
and as part of that, he also teaches, right? But there's a lot of things that you can do if you're interested in that field. You'd be surprised that the sort of variety of jobs that you can get, and some of them, like you're doing already, you're creating for yourself, right? I think if you really want to study something like that, I would say, this might not be the best advice in the world, but like, if you're able to get like a scholarship, definitely consider it, right? That's the caveat though. You don't want to be paying out of pocket for, especially for like a graduate degree. If you know exactly what it will do for your career, it might be worth the investment, right? But if you're a little bit on the fence, right, I would say look for sources of funding if they're able to fund you at least for half or the majority of it. It's definitely a worthwhile investment because in a lot of cases, it will open up new roads for you to consider that you didn't even know were there prior to starting.
Yeah. I think so before I'm graduating here in December. I'll be graduating from my undergrad. And like I said, I was looking into grad school. Now that I've kind of thought more about what it is exactly that I want to do, and the answer is I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think it was best to just commit to something and go into a graduate degree right away. So I'm going to probably look for a job and then kind of see where that goes. But originally my idea was to go to law school, and I started preparing for the LSAT, which is the admission exam, um, and then the more I looked into it, and the more I realized that maybe law school wasn't necessarily something that I wanted to do, I was like, well, maybe I'll just go as long as I get a full ride. If I get a full ride, then maybe I'll go. And then as I kept on, preparing for the entrance exam, it was a big time investment. I wasn't enjoying it, and I realized like if I do get in, whatever, if I end up becoming a lawyer, it doesn't seem like it's something that I really want to do. It's a big time investment in general, so I'm probably just not gonna do that. Like why do I want to keep doing that? It's just not worth it, right? So I put that idea to the side, and I've been wanting to try new things and see what I do enjoy. One of the things that I do like, and the main reason I say I want to try this podcast was because as I said before, I like to learn. I like certain things, right? So neuroscience, I like history, I like nutrition and physical therapy and exercise, and I like um space and aerospace engineering and stuff like that. A bunch of different things. And it'd be really hard to get in depth, like degree wise, and try to get study something in depth, um, and just cover all those bases, right? So by doing this, I have the ability to talk to a bunch of different people that have a lot of different backgrounds and learn from these things, uh, and take away information from that I wanted to learn without having to commit to a single avenue. And I think
Mm,
that's really cool.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, right on. I totally
Yeah.
agree.
So that's I think the main reason why I wanted to do this and to talk to a lot of people. And I was earlier I was trying to think kind of like where this idea could go, or how I could then use this idea to create other avenues and so on. And I think the more I learn from about certain topics, I'll then have a clear idea of what it is that I want to perhaps specialize in. And just without necessarily having to put the podcast aside, and I could still keep it going, but then get into that specific field a little more, you know?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I think a great example of that is Tim Ferriss, right? Like he's kind of he's like a jack of all trades, you know, he's dipped his toe in many a pool, but you know, he never had to get like a PhD in a specific area, right? Like he got a lot of it through trial and error, and obviously through his podcasting, right? Like he's learned a lot through that. I mean, it's part of his like personal branding at this point, right?
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
listen to Tim Ferriss, so I wouldn't be able to tell you much about him or his podcast. But I listen, like I said, I listen to Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan is similar in that sense. You know,
Yeah.
he gets
Yeah.
to talk to all these interesting people, and learn a lot of different things from them.
Right.
And you know what the thing is, like, I really like listening to. I usually listen to most episodes, right? There are some that jump out more than others, but whenever I listen to some episode that I'm really intrigued by, sometimes it won't cover all of the curiosities that I have. And so I'll kind of still wonder about certain things. And I think to myself, like, oh, maybe it would have been good to ask this thing, or maybe it would have been good to talk about this other topic and see how it incorporates to this other thing they were discussing. And so by kind of having the ability to host my own podcast and talk to the guests that I invite, I then have the power to kind of ask those things and have the ability to discuss the things that I want to discuss and cover whatever question is that I wanted to cover, you know. So having that ability to learn what I want to learn, it's a very cool thing to be able to have.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I think yeah, I find that there's a connection there to why I like history too. Like it's kind of like the process you described. Like I grew up reading a lot of literature, but also like myths, like the ancient Greek, Roman myths and stuff like that. Um, and ever since then, it's a process of just digging into the past and finding things that like new things, new areas that you really enjoy. Like right now I'm studying something that's kind of niche. It's kind of about like land use and politics. But when I was doing my MA, for example, I was writing about the history of sports in Taiwan. And that's something I just really like because I'm a, you know, a semi-competitive athlete. And I personally really enjoy the whole physical aspect of sports, right? And just being interested in that made me ask some questions about, you know, when exactly did modern sports kind of come into being? When did the Olympics come into being, right? It's seen as this ancient Greek, you know, almost like religious event, but you know, the modern Olympics are really a product of the late 19th century. Like it's actually quite recent, you know. So I think yeah, like personal interests, there's so many ways to sort of pursue them. You can learn more about these interests by talking to people, like just as you have, right? You can also learn them if you're in a specific area of study, you can learn them through picking up new books in certain historical genres, for example, like the history of science, history of sports, right? History of like culinary culture, right? There's all kinds of stuff out there.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the sports thing, because when you mentioned at the beginning about how you do long distance running, I kind of wanted to talk about that because you said that you studied, yeah, well, about sports history as well. Did you mainly focus on Taiwanese sports history, or more so like like around the world?
Yeah, so it was Taiwan and Japan. So it was Taiwan when it was a Japanese colony. So
Okay.
this is from 1895 to 1945. And the reason why it the story of sport in Taiwan starts there is because like I said, a lot of modern sports really come into being in the 19th century. And in a lot of cases, there obviously are exceptions, right? But the sports we think of today, like soccer, right? Like football, which is kind of derived from like rugby football, as far as I know, I think. Um, or like baseball, right? A lot of these sports really come into being in the 19th century in Western countries like Europe, the United States. And the reason why it has an interesting history in East Asia, I studied baseball because that was one of the earliest organized team sports that was brought to Taiwan. It was brought by I think Japanese educators and government officials who are working in Taiwan. And it had become popular in Japan, I think in the 1870s or 70s and 80s, because there were American sailors who were playing the game, and it eventually became popular. And the whole process of that sport being imported into Taiwan, and then becoming gradually more popular over time, until today it's considered one of the national sports of Taiwan, right? Totally, it has nothing to do with the Chinese nationalist government that came right in the 1940s, right? It's something that was already a legacy of Japanese colonial rule, and yet today it exists in this sort of hybrid state, right? It was, the Japanese formal political influence is totally gone, but you have a lot of these cultural remnants like baseball, certain types of cuisine that are left over, right? So I think, like if you trace the history of a sport in a specific nation state, or even, the history of a sport that goes across nations, it goes international, I find that story to be really interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. I mean, baseball is pretty big in Japan still today, right?
Exactly, it's
I
huge.
think there's a lot of, I'm pretty sure there's quite a few Japanese players in the major leagues.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Did you ever play baseball or no?
No, I never played baseball. I've always been sort of into track and field and distance running, just partially because my high school was situated in a mountain near Taipei, and it was like there wasn't a lot of room for sports fields, but we did have like cross country running, and so that's partially why I started with running. But it's also because I was a really chubby kid, and actually I started exercising mostly just to like lose weight and get fit. And running was like the easiest. It wasn't the easiest, but it was like the most like cost efficient way to do that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I stuck with distance running.
Did you run track in college? Did you run track at Virginia? I know.
I was on the club team. I wasn't good enough to go varsity. But yeah, I was on the club team. And yeah, I've just been training consistently. I just want to, get personal bests in my events.
Yeah.
And it provides like a really nice counterbalance to everything else that I have to do, work wise.
Yeah, I've been getting more into running lately. I I want to be able to work my way up to try to run a marathon at some point.
Oh wow. Good
Yeah,
on
so
you. Yeah.
I ran actually like a couple weeks ago, the most I've ever ran before, which was like a little under 10 miles. I had never run that much
Whoa,
before.
that's a lot. That's a lot of miles. Yeah.
And so I mean, it's in the grand scheme of things, out of like long distance runners, 10 miles isn't a huge deal, but you for me, I've never really enjoyed just running to run. However, like recently when I went out and I ran those almost 10 miles, it was like 9 point something. I ran 15 kilometers, which is I think a little under 10 miles, but um I kind of remembered that from whenever I do run these long distances, it it kind of liberates you from built up stress, from you being overwhelmed with everyday things, and you're really just focused on just going, because you get to a point where you're really tired, and you're not thinking about your problems anymore. You're thinking about just keep going, just keep going, and like you're just focused in the moment, and it's a good way, I find, to kind of relieve just everyday stress. So I've been wanting to get more into it. mostly I've just over the past years, I played football at the University of Miami.
Hmm.
I stopped playing a little while ago, but like half a year ago, a little more. But mainly after that, I just did kind of like weight training, not so much cardio or distance running and stuff like that. Just because I enjoy weight training more. But then I also realized that, I got to start incorporating more cardiovascular training just because it's also important to keep the heart healthy, and I want to be like balanced overall, not just be like strong but not cardiovascularly fit. So I wanted to
Hmm.
incorporate both things. But yeah, I find that it's a good stress reliever, and it's just a good way to build up your mental strength and mindset.
For sure, for sure. Yeah, I like it. How did you find like football and like team sports in general? Like, was your experience good? Like, did you enjoy it? Because I gather you must have played a lot in high school, right? In order to go onto the team, right?
Yeah, I played. So in high school, I played. I'm from Mexico City,
Mm,
and I played in Mexico right before I came over here to the U.S. Um, my last 2.5 years of high school, I did in a boarding school, and I played football there. And then from there, I got recruited to play in college. Um, it was it was good. I Overall, it was a very good experience to have. I've taken away from it a lot of good things. I think the biggest thing I've probably taken away from it is just like the discipline it's given me, and like
right.
the life structure it has given me. Because before I went to my boarding school, I was also like pretty chubby. I was like maybe 14, 15 years old, and I was around 235.
Well,
And yeah, and then I started playing football, changed positions when I went to the US, and then I dropped to like 176, 175.
wow.
Yeah, so um and not just dropping weight, but then starting to play that sport and competitively, and then in college it built up this structure and discipline in my life to then just take that away from it to apply to every sense of
Hmm.
my life, not just sports. So I think it was a really good experience. I think there are um I didn't get to play like in a Division 1 school it's really competitive. So I never really got any game reps. Um and so that wasn't ideal, right? It was also like what I did, I played a position that's called long snapper, which is
Hmm.
special teams. I'm not sure if you know what it is, but it's not a very fun position. It's like kind of boring. It's very specialty oriented position. And I didn't like it that much, that position in particular. I liked the sport, and just having to do that thing that I didn't like that much over and over again, I somewhat lost that joy that I initially had for the sport. I never So at first I was what got me into the sport in the first place was I just really enjoyed watching it, and I really wanted to play it. And but I wanted to be like the main guy, right? I wanted to be the
Hmm.
quarterback. I never really
Hmm.
got to be the quarterback. And I just played what I played. But yeah, I kind of lost my joy for the sport. I don't really watch it that much anymore. I just do
Mm,
other things, and I prefer
yeah.
to watch other things. In that sense, that's not ideal, that I kind of lost the a lot of the joy I found in it. But I took a lot more positive things than I did negative.
Hmm.
So it was a good experience. Definitely a good experience.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I've never well, I played like very few team sports. Um, but I find that, like cross country and track, there's kind of a team element to it, like cross country at least, because you have to score. But it's kind of separate. Like everyone's together but separate. Like I think what's really beautiful about like distance running or track and field events is that it's kind of like it's so pared down. There's so few variables that it's really down to like physiology, mental toughness, and the ability to sort of discipline, like you said, like discipline yourself just to see it over and over again, the kind of training you have to do and like complete it. I think it definitely teaches you a lot about like how to approach life in general, right? Like I think a lot of like what I've learned about how to be productive at work or whatever comes from that physical discipline of the sport. So I think
Yeah,
it's super valuable. Yeah.
I would have liked. Um, there's some. I really enjoy driving, for example. One of the things that I kind of wanted to try when I was a little kid was to try and like drive these Formula One cars, or try to get to that point.
Hmm.
I never really got too much into it. Nowadays, I still really do enjoy that, and whenever I go like go karting or stuff like that, I have a blast. But that's kind of like a one person sport, it's not a team sport like football or soccer or whatever. Um, I think and I believe that for me personally, I tend to prefer that aspect of just being by yourself, um, in terms of sports, because it whether you win or whether you lose, it comes down to you. And if you
Right.
if you're a tennis player and you have a bad match and you lose, you know, you can't blame other people. You didn't play as well, the other person was better, and they beat you. If you win, you were better than the person, you prepared better most of the time, and you know that's on you. So having that sense of that pressure that's dependent upon your sole performance without having to depend on other people, I think I prefer that. Um,
Right.
but definitely being in a team is also a valuable experience because you get to you well, I think the most evident thing is you get to build friendships, and I'll definitely have friends.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, that like I'll continue to talk to these people for probably the rest of my life. A lot of these people, just because you go through a lot of things together and training and practice, whatever, that you went it's like kind of like the army. You go through these things together. You understand what what was felt between each other and the pain of the moment, and then you're like, okay, we can relate to that, and you kind of get closer to that person that way. That's one of the things that are cool, that is cool about being in a team sport. But then yeah, but just being in a I think I prefer just being in a one person sport. I think that's just more of my personal preference. I'm not saying it's better or anything. It's just what I think I prefer.
Hmm. Yeah.
But yeah, that's my belief in that sense. And it was a good experience, definitely. And I did take away good things from it. Have you played team sports or just stuck to track and field?
Yeah. So I just hilarious. Like I really enjoy watching like rugby football. Um, and I tried playing it like just like a couple of times, and it wasn't even like real like rugby, it was like flag rugby. Um, and I had so much fun doing it. But like I got these like these out of disproportionately severe injuries just from playing like even just like flag rugby, that I was like, I can't do this. I'm not suitable for it. Like I hit my head a couple times and I get like stitches on both times. And like one was like right above my eye. So I was
Yeah.
like, yeah, I'm good. Got kicked in the face with a cleat. Um, so like, I'm good. I'm gonna stick with like, yeah. So in high school, I did a lot of, yeah, I stuck with like track and cross. And also, I also enjoyed like weightlifting too. I don't do it primarily. Right now, I do weights and like plyometrics mostly just to support my running, because I really want to like squeeze out, more, sort of higher performances before I get too old for like speed
Yeah.
performances. Um, but I envision that I'll probably do a lot more like weight or power work like the older I get, because it'll just, yeah, you'll preserve those gains more easily, I think.
And it's important to be balanced in that sense, right? Like
Right,
when
exactly.
if you run a lot, but then you have um stronger legs overall, stronger quads, stronger hamstrings, stronger calves, stronger glutes, everything. If you just have a stronger base, your risk of injury just reduces because there's a lot more support for your tendons and for your um bones and so on. So just having that um that support, that muscle support is really helpful. So it's important to have that balance. It's like the same thing, but the other way around with me, right? I was mainly just doing weightlifting. And so I was like, well, it's cool that, I get to do weightlifting and I'm getting stronger, but it's also important that I make sure that my heart is healthy because I need to be able to pump a lot of blood to the rest of my body, right? If I have a
Right.
weak heart, then what's the point of being strong if I'm just not gonna be as healthy as I can be? So I think it's a balance. I think people have got to balance a lot of things, and or when it comes to training, right? I don't think just committing to one particular thing is the best. At least that's my opinion. So
Mhm.
incorporating different aspects, I think, is ideal.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Have you?
speaking of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, 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 no. You're fine.
No, I was just gonna say, like, speaking of Joe Rogan, actually, I forgot to say that I did like a couple of years of like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu,
Okay.
mixed martial arts, and I really enjoyed that too. And that's also an example of something that's kind of like a solo sport, right? Like,
Yeah.
obviously you train in a group setting, but when it comes down to it, it's really just up to you and your technique versus one other person's technique, right? Like, and the
Yeah.
beautiful thing
It's
about
you.
BJJ, it's like it's so much technique based. Like you need a lot of power, right? But it's really kind of an art almost. Like you have to learn leverage and like I don't know, like physics, like you have to learn how to get a feel for that kind of movement. And it's
Yeah.
just very enjoyable too. Yeah.
There's an episode he put out recently. If you listen to Joe Rogan, you might have listened to this one, but with someone called Mikey Musumeci.
No, I didn't. I
He's
didn't hear.
Yeah, he's a UFC fighter. And I think he's from the US. Right now, I think he's living in Thailand. I think he fights in like the 145 weight class. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, that weight class, but and I think he just like every day he's just around, I want to say 150. No, I think he fights in 135-pound division. And he
Mm,
walks around like at around 150, 155. So,
mm,
you know, he was saying that he's trained with these a lot bigger athletes than 155, 135, 145-pound area. Um, and he has the ability to sometimes beat these people because even though they're stronger and bigger, if his level is a lot better than their level when it comes to jujitsu, it's not about necessarily strength because you just know, you can see what's coming, you can then react and then um do like do some sort of move or lock in a way that it's a lot more in depth and superior to whatever your opponent is doing, right? So it
mm.
comes down to just preparation and ability instead of strength. Now, if you have a 200-pound guy that goes against a 135-pound and they're in the same skill level, well, then the 200-pound guy's probably going to win, right? But if the 135-pound guy's a lot better, then that's the cool thing about jujitsu is they have the ability to win because it's a lot about technique. It's not so much just about strength and power.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about, or have you ever ran like ultra marathons?
Oh, I haven't even run a marathon. I've run a ton of
Okay,
halves. But I really want to, like I said earlier, I think I really want to focus on getting my speed in like 5K, 10Ks before I hit
got it.
like full marathon. I haven't, I think the idea of the ultra is super cool, like primarily because training like track or shorter distances, a lot of what you're doing is you're like racing on roads or you're racing on the track, and it's just very kind of like monotonous. And it's not it's not monotonous to push yourself to your limit. I think that's always something that is like, that excites me. But the idea of running like a ultra marathon that there's like just untold amounts of elevation and you get to see all this cool scenery, right? Go to these really magnificent trails. I think that's really cool. I would really love to do one at some point, but I'm probably gonna have to run a marathon before I before I get
Yeah.
into ultra marathons. But yeah, I think it's so cool. And it gets to this whole different area of physiology too, because the energy systems you're using in an event that lasts like, like 6 hours is just so different from an event that lasts like 15 or 30 minutes, right?
Yeah. I don't know how the physiology or the body reacts to these more like prolonged events. I'm not too sure about that. What I can speak of out of experience and out of the things that I've learned are like more of these short term kind of training sessions. But I'm sure that when it comes to these longer races, 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever it may be, I think there's some that like go for like a day,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, like when it comes to these, I'm not sure how the body reacts. I just know that the the preparation that must go into that, like it has to be extensive. Like there's no way you can run one of these things without the adequate preparation. I mean, your body would just totally break down. There's definitely a lot that goes into it. I just don't know exactly what it is. It's something that I would have to look into just to learn more about, because it's definitely interesting, and it's a
Yeah.
cool like area of of within the realm of running and like cross country.
Yeah. 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 It's super cool. And it's really about kind of venturing. I think a lot of it is mental for the ultras. Like your body can take a lot of damage, but can your mind, is your mind going to tap out before your body does? In a lot of these cases, I think it really comes down to the mental discipline and toughness, or the ability to really sort of like even like zone out, right, while you're doing something that's physically strenuous. I think it's super cool.
Yeah. In the going forward, do you want to keep kind of like your training and your focus on history aside, or would you like to somehow incorporate them both into what you do?
That's a yeah. The reason why I'm not doing like sports history right now is because it's really kind of a niche subject. Like, it's hard to when you go into research or like a PhD, a graduate degree like this, if you end up doing something in neuroscience or psychology, you'll find this to be the case too, but you have to kind of come down with a specialized area of research. And for practical reasons, I don't know how, in some sense, marketable maybe the history of sport is for my particular field, which is modern East Asia, right? There's a lot of things that I think need to be explored, and I might well do so if I'm in a position to do that. But right now, I kind of want to focus on telling stories that have a more institutional basis, maybe. Not to say that sports doesn't have like institutions or organizations, right? The international Olympic community is, huge, right? Countries have their own like Olympic federations or sports federations. But I think it might be harder to get at some of those sources if you want to write like a historical book or a historical paper about those things. So that's kind of why I've shifted a little bit from that subject, but it's still very close to my heart. And even if I don't do like academia altogether, right, I would still be doing something related to sport, whether or not it has to do with my career. I just find it really, it's something that I think everyone should be integrating into their lives, whether or not their career depends on it.
Yeah, it's done a lot of good for me, given me a lot of benefits to start incorporating sport into my life. Sport and everything that comes with it, just like nutrition, just actual sport, um, kind of like the sports psychology side of it, how sleep plays into it, how stress plays into it, all these different things. They've done a lot of good for me and given me a lot of benefits. So I think that, to continue integrating them in my life as well is something that I will for sure do. And maybe at some point I would like to try to help others see the importance of these things, and to incorporate them in their lives so that they can improve their lives in a lot of ways as I've done, as those things have done in mine. So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I agree with you, whether it be, and it's similar for me, like whether it be something that I actually focus my main career on or something I more like focus more on the side of or something. It's definitely something that I want to keep incorporating, and I think people should definitely incorporate for physical health, for mental health, and just for overall well-being.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that's a good way to wrap it up and convey that positive message to finish it off with.
Great. Well, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed chatting with you and getting to know you, Alan.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it as well. I think you have a lot of cool stuff going for you, and I think what you're studying is very interesting, both the Taiwanese history and modern history about East Asia, and also, sport history that you previously were into and studied, and but you still are, but you aren't studying as thoroughly perhaps anymore. I think that's really cool, and hey, man, I will definitely stay on the lookout for anything that you keep doing, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Likewise, I'll keep tuning into your podcast. Yeah, let's stay in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.